Hello and welcome. I invite you to sit back, to rest, and to let the quiet flow around you. Tonight, we travel together into a story woven with snow, silence, and memory. It is the story of a family, once among the most powerful in the world. A family whose name carried centuries of rule and whose lives ended in the shadows of history. This is the story of the Romanovs, Russia's last Tsar, and the dynasty that fell with him. For more than 300 years, the Romanov crown glittered above an empire vast beyond imagination, stretching from the frozen Arctic seas to the mountains of Siberia to the palaces of St. Petersburg. Tsars and Tsarinas ruled with splendor, wrapped in jewels, tradition, and faith. The people bowed, the churches blessed, and it seemed as if their reign would last forever. But nothing in history lasts forever, and beneath the glitter, the empire trembled. Peasants suffered in hunger, workers labored without hope, soldiers marched into wars that drained their spirit, and in the silence of these struggles, the Romanovs walked, unaware of how fragile their crown had become. At the heart of this story is Tsar Nicholas II, a man devoted to his wife Alexandra and to his children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and little Alexei. To him, they were not rulers of millions, but simply family. And yet, the burden of empire rested heavily upon him, a weight that would shape their fate. In the chapters that follow, we will walk through their world together. The palaces and rituals, the storms of war, the whispers of revolution, and finally, the silence of the end. So let us begin, calmly, gently, with the world of crowns, the world of the Romanovs. In the year 1894, the Russian Empire is vast, endless forests, frozen rivers, golden domes glimmering under snow. And in the heart of this empire, in St. Petersburg, a young man becomes Tsar. His name is Nicholas Alexandrovich Romanov. Nicholas II. He is the heir to 300 years of Romanov rule. To millions, he is God's chosen autocrat, ruler of all the Russias. To history, he will be remembered as the last Tsar. Nicholas was not a man of ambition or grand visions. He was gentle, polite, quiet. He loved books, long walks by the sea, the company of his wife Alexandra. He was happiest not in the throne room, but at home with his children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and his son, Alexei. To him, they were simply family, not the symbols of an empire. Their life, within palace walls, seemed timeless, chandeliers glowing above marble halls, guards in polished boots lining grand staircases, banquets served on golden plates. In summer, they escaped to palaces by the sea where the children laughed in gardens. In winter, snow blanketed the grounds while the family gathered in candle-lit rooms. It appeared unshakable, a dynasty unbroken for centuries. The Romanov crest, the double-headed eagle, spread its wings across coins, documents, and churches. The people prayed for the Tsar, bowed to his portrait, sang hymns in his name. For generations, it seemed the crown would never fall. Yet, beneath this glittering image, Russia was restless. The empire was rich in land, but poor in equality. Peasants worked frozen soil for little bread. Workers crowded into factories, dreaming of dignity. Soldiers served far from home, their pay small, their burden heavy, and while the palaces glowed with gold, whispers of discontent traveled through villages and city streets. Nicholas believed deeply in his role as Tsar. He saw his crown not as a choice, but as a sacred duty. He prayed often, certain that his rule was guided by God. But in his heart, he was not a ruler of steel. He was a husband, a father, a man who longed for peace and family more than politics or reform. This contrast, the gentleman and the heavy crown, would define his reign. For while he clung to tradition, the world around him began to change. The empire, immense and beautiful, was also fragile. And though the Romanovs still sat upon their thrones, the foundation beneath was already beginning to crack. Here, in the glow of chandeliers and the laughter of royal children, the last chapter of the dynasty quietly began. Behind the crown, behind the ceremonies and the endless rituals, Nicholas II was, above all, a family man. To history, he was the Tsar of Russia, but to his wife and children, he was simply Papa. Nicholas married Princess Alix of Hesse, who became Alexandra Feodorovna. She was shy, deeply spiritual, and utterly devoted to her husband. Their love letters still survive, tender, filled with little endearments. She called him Nicky, he called her Sonny. In their hearts, they were not rulers of an empire, but partners, bound by quiet affection. Together, they had 5 children, 4 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia, each with her own charm. Olga, thoughtful and serious; Tatiana, graceful and organized; Maria, gentle and warm-hearted; and Anastasia, playful, mischievous, always laughing. And then, their youngest, Alexei, the long-awaited heir to the throne. Alexei was born in 1904, bringing joy to the family, but with his birth came sorrow as well. For Alexei carried a hidden illness, hemophilia, a disease that meant his blood would not clot. A simple fall, a bruise, even a small cut, could bring days of agony, even death. This secret shaped the family's life. The Tsar and Tsarina lived with constant fear, watching their son, protecting him from even the smallest injury. When Alexei fell ill, the palace fell into silence, waiting, praying. This burden drew Alexandra deeper into faith, and deeper into the belief that miracles were possible. Yet within their private world, there was warmth. Nicholas adored his children. He joined their games, walked with them in gardens, taught them to row on quiet rivers. The girls wrote in their diaries about evenings with their parents, about laughter, about simple joys. Behind the palace gates, they lived as a family more than a dynasty. But outside those gates, Russia grew restless. The contrast was stark. While peasants struggled in fields, the Romanov children played in grand halls. While workers toiled in crowded factories, the Tsar's daughters embroidered and read poetry. The family's seclusion, their isolation, became another stone in the growing wall between ruler and people. Nicholas was faithful, loving, and kind as a father. But as a ruler, his devotion to family made him blind to the cries of his nation. His world was Alexandra and the children. His throne to him was an extension of his duty to them. And so, while the family laughed and prayed within their palace walls, the empire outside edged closer to unrest. Their bond was strong, but no bond of love could shield them from the storms that history was about to bring. While the Romanovs lived in palaces of marble and gold, the people of Russia lived a very different life. Across the endless fields, peasants worked the soil with bare hands. The winters were long, food was scarce, and hunger never far away. Many dreamed of bread, of land, of a life with dignity. In the growing cities, factories roared with machines. Men, women, and even children worked long hours for little pay. The air was heavy with smoke, the streets crowded and cold. Strikes began to ripple through the working class. People wanted change, a voice, a future beyond survival. But the empire remained rigid. Nicholas believed that the crown was sacred, given by God. To question the Tsar was to question the divine order. And so reforms were slow, promises shallow, and discontent only deepened. Then came 1905. On a cold January morning, thousands of workers marched peacefully through the streets of St. Petersburg. They carried icons, sang hymns, and held petitions, asking for better conditions, for justice, for bread. At their head was Father Gapan, a priest who believed the Tsar would listen to his people. They walked to the Winter Palace, not with weapons, but with hope. But the Tsar was not there, and the soldiers waiting at the gates did not open their arms. They opened fire. The snow turned red. Men, women, and children fell in the streets. This day would be remembered as Bloody Sunday. The shock spread across Russia like fire. The Tsar, once called Little Father, was now seen as distant, even cruel. Strikes erupted. Revolution stirred. Nicholas was forced to grant concessions, a parliament, the Duma, but his heart resisted. He still believed his rule was absolute. Every step toward change he later pulled back. The people felt betrayed, and then came war, the Russo-Japanese War, far from home, in distant seas. Russia's pride was shattered as its fleet was destroyed. Thousands died. And for what? The people saw not glory, but waste. By the time peace returned, the bond between Tsar and people was weakened, perhaps beyond repair. For peasants, hunger remained. For workers, conditions worsened. For soldiers, loyalty began to fray. Inside the palace, the Romanovs still prayed together, still lived with quiet devotion. But outside, the empire trembled. The Tsar's crown glittered in candlelight, yet beneath it, the foundation was cracking. This was no longer just discontent, it was the beginning of revolution. And though Nicholas held tightly to his throne, history had already begun to pull it from beneath him. In the heart of the palace, the Romanovs carried a secret. The health of young Alexei, the heir to the throne, was fragile. Born with hemophilia, every fall, every bruise, every small wound could bring danger. The boy's pain became the family's burden, and his mother, Alexandra, searched desperately for hope. That hope came in the form of a wandering mystic. His name was Grigory Rasputin, a peasant from Siberia, tall and unkempt, with piercing eyes that seemed to look through the soul. To many, he was a holy man. To others, a fraud. But to Alexandra, he was a miracle. When Alexei bled, when doctors failed, Rasputin prayed. And somehow, the boy calmed. His bleeding slowed. His life was spared again and again. For Alexandra, this was not coincidence. This was divine intervention. She came to believe that Rasputin was sent by God to protect her son, and so he entered their world, a man of rough manners, yet welcomed into the most private chambers of the Tsar's family. He advised Alexandra, he whispered comfort. He became not only healer, but protector, a shadow that lingered near the throne. But outside the palace, whispers grew. The nobles despised him. The court gossiped. Stories spread of his wild behavior, of drinking, of scandals, of women. Pamphlets mocked him, painted him as a devil in monk's robes. The people began to see the Tsarina, and through her, the Tsar himself, under his influence. The faith of the empire weakened further. Nicholas trusted his wife. Alexandra trusted Rasputin. And in this chain of faith, decisions for an empire were shaped by the prayers of a peasant mystic. For the Romanovs, he was a savior. For Russia, he became a symbol of corruption, of decay, of a monarchy blind to its people. The more his presence grew, the deeper the hatred around him spread. Assassination attempts came and failed. Yet Rasputin endured, his shadow stretching long across the final years of the dynasty. In the candle-lit rooms of the palace, he soothed Alexei's pain. He gave Alexandra comfort. And to Nicholas, weary of war and unrest, he gave silence and reassurance. But outside, in the streets, the name Rasputin was poison, a symbol that the Tsar no longer belonged to his people, but to a mystic spell. The empire was trembling, and Rasputin's presence only widened the distance between crown and country. History often turns on symbols, and in Rasputin, the people saw not a holy man, but a sign that the Romanovs had lost their way. The year is 1914. The world is shifting. Nations arming, alliances tightening, the drums of war echoing across Europe. And then, a spark in the Balkans sets fire to the continent. The Great War begins. For Russia, it is a call to arms. Millions are summoned. Peasants leaving their fields, workers leaving their factories, sons leaving their families. They march in long lines, boots striking frozen ground, uniforms too thin for the winters ahead. Some carry rifles, some carry nothing at all. Yet all are told they fight for Tsar and motherland. At first, there is pride, a belief that victory will bring honor. Crowds fill the streets, cheering soldiers as they depart. But the hope fades quickly. Russia is unprepared. The factories cannot keep pace. The armies lack supplies. Hunger follows the men into the trenches. Bullets run short. Boots fall apart. And still, the war drags on. The losses are staggering. Hundreds of thousands fall in the mud, in the snow, in battles fought far from home. Letters never return. Families wait in silence. The empire bleeds. Nicholas, feeling duty press upon him, makes a fateful choice. He leaves the capital. He takes personal command of the army at the front. To him, it is an act of devotion, a way to lead his soldiers as a true Tsar. But in doing so, he leaves his throne vulnerable. The empire is placed in the hands of Alexandra, and beside her, Rasputin. In Petrograd, whispers grow louder. The people see defeats at the front, shortages in the cities and in the palace. A Tsarina guided by a mystic's hand. Trust shatters. Faith crumbles. For Alexandra, it is agony. Her husband away, her son ill, her burden heavy. She clings to Rasputin's prayers, believing he alone can preserve her family. But outside, his presence fuels anger. Pamphlets spread wild rumors of betrayal, of treachery, of a monarchy ruled not by reason, but by superstition. And still, the war consumes. Fields once golden with wheat now stand empty. Trains that carried grain now carry weapons. Factories that once clothed the people now clothe soldiers. The cost is hunger, cold, despair. In the trenches, men mutter not of glory, but of futility. In the cities, workers strike, peasants riot, families beg for bread. The war that was meant to unite begins to divide. Nicholas carries the weight of command, but each loss, each retreat, weakens his crown. And while he leads his armies in mud and snow, his empire slips further from his grasp. The Great War was not only a battlefield abroad, it was a battlefield within Russia itself, and in its smoke and sorrow, the Romanovs' world drew closer to its end. The winter of 1917 was bitter. Snow piled high in Petrograd. Bread lines stretched for blocks. Mothers clutched children in the cold, waiting, hoping, only to hear the same words. No bread today. Hunger became anger. Anger became marches. And soon, marches became revolution. It began with workers striking in the factories. Then women joined, crying for bread, for peace, for an end to suffering. Their voices echoed through the icy streets. Down with the war! Down with the Tsar! The crowds grew each day. Tens of thousands filled the squares, carrying banners, chanting, demanding change. The soldiers, weary from war and cold, were ordered to fire on the crowds. But many refused. Some lowered their rifles. Some even joined the marchers. The tide had turned. The Tsar's own army no longer stood against the people, but with them. News of the uprising reached Nicholas at the front. He rushed back, believing he could still hold his empire together. But by the time he arrived, it was too late. His ministers resigned. His supporters vanished. The Duma declared itself the voice of the people. On a train halted in the snow, Nicholas faced the truth. He no longer had the power to command. The generals told him the war was lost. The politicians told him the crown could not be saved. Even his own army would not defend him. And so, on March 15, 1917, Nicholas signed the document that ended more than 300 years of Romanov rule. He abdicated the throne, not just for himself, but for his son, Alexei, too fragile to bear the weight of empire. The crown passed into silence. In the streets of Petrograd, church bells tolled. Crowds cheered, singing, waving red banners. The monarchy had fallen. The Romanovs, once seen as eternal, were now prisoners of history. For Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children, life changed in an instant. From rulers of millions, they became captives. Their palaces were closed, their servants dismissed, their guards replaced by watchful soldiers. And yet, inside their private world, they clung to each other. Nicholas wrote tender words in his diary. The children read, embroidered, prayed. Alexandra remained devoted to her husband, certain their suffering was only a test from God. But outside, the storm raged on. The provisional government struggled for control. The Bolsheviks whispered of a new order, and the people, once subjects of a Tsar, were restless, uncertain, hungry still. The Romanovs were gone from the throne, but for Russia, the revolution had only just begun. After the abdication, the Romanovs were no longer rulers, but prisoners. At first, they remained in familiar places, Tsarskoye Selo, surrounded by gardens where they had once walked freely, but guards now patrolled the grounds. The family's movements were restricted. Visitors were forbidden. Even the children, once princes and princesses of the empire, were not allowed beyond the gates. They prayed. They wrote in diaries. They tried to preserve a sense of normal life. Nicholas chopped wood for exercise. The girls sewed dresses, read aloud, sang softly in the evenings, and Alexandra, still frail in health, leaned on her faith, whispering that God's will would protect them. But as months passed, the revolution deepened. Russia was changing, and the Romanovs could not remain near Petrograd. In August of 1917, soldiers arrived with orders. The family would be moved. Their journey was long and uncertain. First to Tobolsk in Siberia, a quiet town far from power, far from loyalists. Here, winter was cruel. Snow fell endlessly, burying streets, isolating the family in a governor's mansion turned prison. Yet, even in this exile, they kept their routine. Lessons for Alexei, embroidery for the girls, daily prayers, and in the evenings, Nicholas reading aloud to his children. For a time, it seemed their lives might pass quietly in Siberia. But history had other plans. In late 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power, and with their rise, the fate of the Romanovs grew darker. By spring of 1918, whispers reached the family. They would be moved again, this time not to comfort, but to confinement. Their destination, Ekaterinburg, an industrial city in the Ural Mountains. The house chosen for them had an ironic name. It was called the House of Special Purpose. From the outside, it looked like any merchant's home. Plain walls, shuttered windows, a small garden. But barbed wire soon went up. Guards patrolled the grounds with rifles. The family's world shrank to a few dimly lit rooms. Inside, the Romanovs tried to hold on to hope. The children played games with scraps of paper. Alexei, often ill, was carried from room to room, smiling through his pain. Nicholas kept his diary, writing short, simple notes, played cards with the children, weather gray, read aloud tonight. Small gestures of normalcy in a life that was no longer their own. Yet shadows lengthened. The guards grew harsher. The family's jewels, once hidden in hems and pillows, were discovered. Food was scarce. Letters to friends were intercepted, and still, the Romanovs prayed. They clung to each other. They believed they might yet be rescued, that foreign allies or loyal Russians would come. But beyond those walls, Russia had turned its back. The revolution demanded a new order, and the presence of the Tsar, even as a prisoner, was too dangerous for that new world to bear. The House of Special Purpose was not just a prison, it was a waiting place, and the Romanovs, though they did not know it yet, were waiting for their final chapter. Ekaterinburg, July 1918. The summer air was heavy, but inside the House of Special Purpose the walls felt colder than ever. On the evening of July 16th, the Romanov family gathered in their rooms as they always did. The daughters stitched quietly. Alexei, frail from illness, lay in his chair. Nicholas read softly from a book, his voice steady, trying to ease the tension he surely felt. Alexandra clutched her cross, lips moving silently in prayer. There had been rumors, whispers of rescue, of White Army soldiers drawing near. The family allowed themselves a flicker of hope. Perhaps freedom was close, perhaps this nightmare would soon end. But outside, plans were already in motion. The Bolsheviks had decided the Romanovs must not fall into the hands of their enemies. The family's very existence was seen as a threat. Shortly after midnight, guards entered their rooms. They told the family they must move to a safer place. There had been unrest in the city, they said. The Romanovs dressed quickly. Alexei was carried down by Nicholas. The daughters supported their mother, and together they were led into a dim basement room. The air was damp, the light a single bulb overhead. The family sat together, waiting. They still believed this was just another transfer. Minutes passed, and then the guards re-entered. A piece of paper was read aloud. The order of execution. Nicholas turned to his family. He barely had time to whisper words of comfort before the first shots rang out. Chaos filled the basement. Gunfire, smoke, shouts. The daughters, who had sewn jewels into their corsets for safekeeping, were shielded by them at first, their bodies resisting bullets. But the guards pressed on. The room became a storm of violence, and then silence. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries was no more. In that basement, history shifted. The last Tsar, his wife, his 5 children, their lives extinguished in a single night. Afterward, the bodies were hidden, taken into the Ural countryside, buried in haste, as if to erase the memory of what had been done. But memory cannot be erased so easily. For the Romanovs left more than a crown behind. They left diaries filled with words of tenderness, letters of faith, images of a family who, in their last days, clung to each other with love stronger than fear. And though their reign ended in tragedy, their story continues to echo like a whisper carried through time. The final night in Ekaterinburg was not just the end of a family. It was the end of an empire and the beginning of a new Russia, forged in blood, shadow, and silence. In the days after the Romanovs' deaths, silence settled over Russia. The city of Ekaterinburg whispered rumors. Some spoke of gunshots in the night, others of carts seen leaving the house at dawn. But the truth was hidden. The Bolsheviks released only fragments, and even those were tangled in lies. For years the world wondered, had the Tsar truly perished? Had Alexandra and the children been spared? Stories spread of survivors, of Anastasia escaping into the shadows, of Alexei smuggled to safety. Fairy tales whispered across borders, giving comfort to those who could not bear the thought of such an ending. Yet, behind closed doors, the Soviet state moved on. The empire was gone. The red flag now flew where the double-headed eagle once soared. Factories, collectives, and armies marched under a new vision, one that demanded the old order be erased, but the memory of the Romanovs could not be erased, not from the hearts of exiles who carried their portraits across oceans, not from the diaries preserved in hidden drawers, not from the quiet prayers spoken in candlelit churches. Decades passed, and slowly, truth surfaced. Investigators uncovered shallow graves in the Ural forests, bones matched to the Tsar and his family, jewels fused into the soil by fire, a final, haunting testimony of their fate. In 1981, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia canonized the family as martyrs, honoring their faith and dignity in the face of suffering. And in 2000, the Russian Orthodox Church inside Russia declared them passion bearers, not saints for miracles, but for enduring tragedy with grace. At last, in 1998, 80 years after their deaths, the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their children were laid to rest in St. Petersburg, buried with the honors denied them in life. The bells of the Peter and Paul Cathedral tolled as their coffins were lowered. A dynasty returned to the city of its birth. Even today, their story lingers like a shadow on Russian history. It is the story of power lost, of innocence destroyed, and of a family bound by love to the very end. It reminds us how swiftly empires can crumble, how fragile crowns can be, and how even in silence, memory speaks. The fall of the Romanovs is not just a Russian tragedy. It is a human one, a reminder that history is not only written in palaces and battlefields, but also in the quiet tears of families, and in the last embraces shared in the darkest of nights. And so, the story of the Romanovs drifts into silence. An empire that glittered with palaces and jewels, ended not with ceremony, but in shadows. Yet within that silence, something remains. If you listen closely, you can almost hear their voices, the laughter of the 4 sisters echoing down palace halls, the steady voice of Nicholas reading to his children, the soft prayers of Alexandra whispered in candlelight, the fragile breath of Alexei dreaming of freedom beyond his illness. Though the dynasty was broken, their memory lingers like a candle's flame, gentle, flickering, but never gone. The Romanovs remind us that power is fleeting, but love, courage, and faith leave marks deeper than crowns or thrones. Their final hours were shrouded in darkness, but their legacy shines with a quiet light, carried forward in history, in faith, in remembrance. Tonight, as you rest, let the story of Russia's last Tsar and his family settle softly in your heart, not as a tale of cruelty alone, but as a reminder of tenderness, resilience, and the bond of family that even death could not break. The fall of the Romanovs was the end of an age, but history still whispers their names, and perhaps it always will. So close your eyes now, breathe slowly, and let this story drift away like snowflakes over St. Petersburg at dusk. Quiet, gentle, endless.